And I want to ask questions of the panel and have you guys kind of discuss. And my first question is there a new vision for state education, something involving soft skills? What are those changes? Maybe, John, you were talking about this a little bit.
The new Commissioner of Education and the State Board of Education have just recently started to go around the state to talk about the new vision for Kansas education. And it's still maintaining a high academic standard, but also to look at and I think it's too general a word when we say soft skills, because then you ask folks, what does that really mean? And you get this kind of stare for a moment. But when you think about what is it going to take for individuals to be successful after high school, work ethic, the ability to work with others, problem solving, being able to work cooperatively, and they've really looked at what does that complete student look like as they move in Kansas education. And a great deal of that vision came about because of conversations they had around the state. They talked to the business community, they talked to the general public. When the commissioner came on board, spent really his first several months traveling the state, talking to individuals and saying, what is it we want to say a Kansas graduate, a person educated here, what they're capable of doing. So it's going to be interesting to see how that progresses over time, particularly when you start talking about the intangible skills that are necessary. How do you describe those? How do you teach them? How do you measure them? How do you determine if a student has met that vision? So it's a lot of work to do, but it should be very interesting and exciting as we move forward.
A little bit more about Common Core. I was wondering how it works in the classroom, if you could just kind of describe that a little bit.
The Common Core state standards are basically goals that the state has and requirements that the state and each individual school district should meet. And I would describe it as a roadmap for the classroom teachers to follow to help the students master subject areas and that are designed to keep them on a level playing field with students across the nation.
Yes, the standards that our teachers are working with, those were established by the state of Kansas. There are some of those that would be common that have been established as part of the Common Core principles, but there's a great number of those that then are individual to each state. So again, that's the framework. How we teach, what we're teaching in what sequence, those types of things are up to the local school districts as you take a look at that. So it has forced us to look at our curriculum and what we would expect students in math and language arts at certain grade levels, because they're going to be held accountable on the state assessment for some of those outcomes to make sure that we're aligned. And it really has raised the bar significantly. And that's something that school districts around the country, as well as here in Kansas, are working to meet those new standards. It'll take time, just like No Child Left Behind. When the testing first started, you saw performance at one level, and over time it continued to increase. And I don't see that being any different this time around either.
Have you seen literacy in our community improving, and what challenges do we face there still?
Well, it's going to be an ongoing challenge. Yes, I've seen it improving. The progress we're making is our students are not where we want them to be yet, but we are making progress. I think what's been really exhilarating is over the last several years, going out and being able to talk in the community about literacy, how important it is, and the efforts we're making, beginning to see really the community coalesce through the business education initiative group that is started with the Chamber of Commerce and is now part of the Leadership Wichita, Project Wichita group. They're actually going to hold a literacy summit later this spring to be able to bring in the groups that are focused on literacy, United Way, and there's so many churches and other groups that are trying. How do we pull all that together, get a focus, and maximize that potential in our community? And I think we have incredible potential here in Wichita because we are such a caring, giving community. I mean, my dream would be you wouldn't have a school-age student that could be at Dillon's at the checkout, that folks in line and the cash register individual aren't asking them, what have you read lately? I mean, that we just become, as proud as we are of being the aviation capital, we're proud of being the literacy capital. And I think we've got that potential. That conversation is really picking up in the idea that if we can unify and be focused in that, we'll have a tremendous impact.
Literacy is extremely important, and with the budget cuts that school districts have experienced in the last few years, we actually have here in Sedgwick County 2 school districts, and we probably have more, but I'm familiar with 2. One of them is the largest school district in Sedgwick County outside of Wichita, and they have 1 librarian now for all the schools. We have another district west of Wichita, which has a half-time librarian for all the schools. And they also, 2 years ago, got rid of all of their reading teachers. The funding in this state is a problem, and as long as we have the current decision makers in Topeka, it will continue to be a problem, and it will get worse.
Sheelu, is this something that you're seeing affecting, you had mentioned the the vocabulary. How do you see literacy kind of feeding into the college scene?
In a more general way, it's more about college readiness. And as you know, that a lot of the tests that students have to take, the standardized testing requires a lot of reading. The word is that the new SAT, the changes to that is focused heavily on reading. So from an aspect of just getting to college, that's one thing, is really that students have to be prepared, but also once they get to college, then the amount of readiness, the preparatory work that they should have had and must come in with because of the demands of higher education. So really important.
What would you say is the biggest misunderstanding about student loans?
It's really about repayment options. That they're doing more and more now in terms of different payment options. It used to be that you took out the student loans and you have 10 years to repay it, and that's it, and students are burdened with that because, first of all, they're borrowing more, and so then that 10-year period. But now that's been expanded to have income-driven repayment. There's also loan forgiveness if you're in a public service type of work, and so you definitely have to check into that. We are doing more extensive programming related to student loans and the repayment of student loans. We offer workshops because we want to inform both the general public and our graduating students. We have exit counseling. We have exit programs for when students graduate because there's so much misinformation out there about student loans and that repayment. So really encourage those who borrow, first of all, to be informed about the borrowing and then know those repayment options.
And are you familiar or knowledgeable about any potential legislation for loan forgiveness nationally?
Just in those public service, that's already existing. And so we try to be out there telling educators, teachers about that, those that work at the college level, and other programs, other employment, that there are options out there for loan forgiveness. Because when you graduate and if you've taken out loans and you're an engineer, those are easier to repay. But in a lot of those lower earning professions, that becomes more difficult. So first of all, we encourage students to borrow less, those that go into those professions, but also there are lots of, don't just avoid repayment and go into default on a loan, that there are lots of options in terms of repayment. And so reach out to whether it's a financial aid office or just the Department of Education has extensive information out on their website. And so your loan servicer, for example, also has extensive information. And so use those resources.
Jim, how do school districts go about allocating their dollars? What is done with that money to support the students?
Well, it's a process that we're actually in the process right now trying to build a budget for next year. And so we try and look at the needs of the students in the buildings. That's our first and foremost priority. So we look at what our enrollment projections are going to be, what the demographics in a building are, what those kind of needs are. So as we try and allocate the funds out, we're really talking about people. And where do we put our people? So if we've got enrollment growth in a particular building, we try and put more staff in that building to address those needs. And so it's a shifting of right now of funds around the district to be able to look at what's the poverty level in a school, how many English as second language students we have in those buildings, and so that we can provide the resources that we have there. It's also a combination of using our title funds as well. We get federal funds in a lot of our buildings, and it is building-based application for that. So, but the title money can only be used on top of what our general funding is. So it's used to supplement what we're already providing. So it really is a process of looking at what the needs are in a particular buildings and what the board decides the direction is that we want to go. If we're trying to address literacy, we try to focus on educationally what we need to fund for that purpose.
Dave, what are some of the biggest challenges that teachers are facing from your vantage point?
Well, from my point of view, and I spend a lot of time in the buildings assisting teachers who have problems. I think one of the biggest issues right now is micromanagement, especially at the elementary level. Teachers don't have the freedom to bring in additional resources and projects that aren't leading them toward the state standards. And I think the state standards are good, but I think there's a little too much micromanagement. I know in some schools, if a teacher, for instance, a math teacher, spends a little too much time on one concept, that could be and has been negatively reflected in their evaluations. I'm aware of some principals who tell elementary teachers that they're to spend a certain amount of time on reading and math, and if they have a lot of questions from students and go over that time, their evaluations reflect that in a negative way. So I think that's one of the big problems I see.
I think our teachers are being asked to continually do more, and unfortunately to do more with less. As the standards have increased, the pressures that are there, as we look at how do we bring new curricular supports to our staff at the same time. We're having to make difficult decisions. The comment was made about librarians, and it's interesting. There's a listserv. Superintendents will ask questions, and they can post across the state. And one of those that I noticed this morning was a question around how many of your districts have cut librarians or are considering, and it was a significant number that already have. We made the decision, a very difficult decision, a number of years back. We do not have high school librarians. We have a clerk that's in the library, and those are the difficult decisions that have occurred and are going to continue to occur with the flat funding and just the increase in our fixed cost on how do we dedicate and try to provide as much support as we can at the classroom level, but there's only so many fixed dollars. And as Mr. Freeman said, as we look at what do we need foundationally, what's that going to take, then what's left as we look at all the other needs. So I think those pressures continue, and at a time where if you look across, you'll find very few school districts over the last several years have been able to even provide cost of living increases for any of their employees. And that makes it difficult. And to piggyback a little on your question about student loans, the cost of education for higher ed continues to increase. I think back to when I was in school at the University of Kansas, I was able to put myself through school working in the summers part-time and not having to take a great deal of loans. Well, now that an in-state school is costing room, board, tuition, those types of things, $25,000, that is pricing itself out of the ability of students to attend. And we're beginning to see that in the education field, in that students that would need to borrow to go to school and to come out of school with $50,000, $70,000, $100,000 in debt aren't going to become teachers. So we're losing an element of the pool that we'll need to draw on for the future. And if you look at the schools of ed across the state of Kansas and across the country, not only with some of the political aspects surrounding education, but just the financial aspects, the numbers are diminishing at a time where we're going to have a significant number of teachers retiring. So I think all those things tie together and create a really difficult environment for our teachers and our principals and our staffs in our building.
And in this environment, is this a factor in why the teachers don't have to purchase their own school supplies? How does this factor in? It's a
lot of decisions, and I'll get to your question, but I'll get there kind of a roundabout way. We talked about challenges for teachers. We talk about and what the decisions that we make in terms of our budget. We're facing right now some very challenging decisions to have to make to balance next year's budget. And one of the things, and I am not suggesting this, but we have about 4,000 teachers in Wichita Public Schools. Okay, if we had 3,000 teachers, we could pay those 3,000 teachers more. But we choose to have 4,000 teachers so that our class sizes are smaller, so that we can provide the interventions that we need. So it's all a matter of making those decisions. Now, to your supplies. Last year, to balance last year's budget, we had the same issues. We had about $14 million of costs and no new money. So we had to balance last year's budget. One of the things that we did was we cut the building budgets, which are basically the supply budgets. This is the teachers' budgets to buy those supplies. We cut it by about 10%. That was $6.5 million in our district. Right? So $6.5 million translates to, guess what, about 100 teachers. Okay, so we made the choice then to reduce the supply budgets to save jobs. We're going to have to be making those same kind of decisions now. So when you talk about how that all works, we make conscious decisions to try and keep, we're a people business, keep the people in the classroom teaching our kids. And if we have to pull back on some of that, unfortunately, that does what happens. We don't ask the teachers to buy their own supplies. We actually believe that there's enough money there to provide the supplies they need. Sometimes it's a matter of convenience as much as anything else. However, but we still have those decisions to make. So we talk about librarians. The fact that Wichita years ago made the choice to eliminate the high school librarians but kept the elementary librarians, again, was a choice they made because they felt that was educationally the most sound thing to do. But when you have to balance a budget, and we got a $20 million hole to have to fill, it's going to be tough. We're going to wind up with some decisions that nobody's going to like, school board or anybody.
Several years ago, one of our largest teacher associations in outside of Wichita in Sedgwick County did a survey on how much money individual teachers or the average amount of money the teachers were expending per year to supplement the school budget out of their own pockets. And if I remember correctly, I believe it was between $300 and $400 per teacher per year that the survey indicated. And that's on top of very insignificant salary increases that teachers have received in the last few years, and not keeping up with the cost of living. So teachers are being squeezed, and that's why we're seeing an exodus from Kansas. Teachers are going to other places where they can have a more substantial income. And I speak to student groups, student teachers, and many of the student teachers I visit with at various college campuses, they're not even looking in Kansas. They're going out of state, and I know, and I think that's tragic.
And how do charter schools and private schools fit into this whole equation?
In my opinion, charter schools, as they were initially authorized in the state of Kansas, I think were fine. I mean, they were still under the publicly elected Board of Education. Private schools are a different matter. I think having public tax dollars go to support private schools, on top of the fact that schools aren't receiving the funding that they should receive, that is going to cause great harm to public education in Kansas, and it needs to stop.
Sure. I think you've seen private schools and public schools coexist for a long time. I mean, if you look in Wichita and you look at the parochial system and the public system, they've coexisted. They each have their benefits, and individuals are able to make their choice on where they would like their children to attend. I think the charter school conversation really is about the details. From my perspective, if you think of charters in the terms of you're trying to provide choice, that's one aspect. The implication that a charter will be more successful than the public schools, the data doesn't bear that out in most cases. As a school district, Wichita provides probably as much choice for our parents with the magnet system as any public school system you'll find in the country. So we do have that choice. My personal feeling, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the school board or anyone else, around charters has been, if that seems to be a solution toward education that folks want to consider, then we need to look at the basic reasons of why. And what you see, unfortunately, in the ALEC legislation and other areas around charters is you are seeing public funds going to what may be for-profit entities with no accountability financially, no accountability on student performance, and the idea that if there are fewer regulations and those types of things that charters have to adhere to, that's better and will give them the advantage. So if that's the case, then take them away from the public schools. If you're going to use the tax dollars for those purposes, then there needs to be accountability there in both performance and finances, and that the regulations that each of us have to meet need to be the same. So it means no cherry picking students. We don't get to do that in the public school. They show up at our door, we educate them. So if you're a charter school and you have 500 seats, then 500 students show up. You don't get to pick which ones you're going to educate or not educate. When you look at making it equitable, people don't want to talk about charters anymore. From a public standpoint, if that's the way charters would be implemented in Kansas, then let's do it. And I think what we'll see is public schools will perform exceptionally well compared to the charters. But that's not the conversation, unfortunately, in Kansas or so many other states. The charter legislation that's been proposed several times in Kansas has been word for word from the ALEC group that has no accountability in any of those measures and allows for-profit entities to hand select which students will participate in those schools and using tax dollars to do so. And that's not equitable to our citizens or to our students.